Hello everyone and welcome to today's session on ISQM1 Unwrapped. Today we'll be looking at International Standard and Quality Management UK number 1, and we'll be hoping to provide you with insights and some tips as you go about designing and implementing your systems of quality management to be in compliance with the standard. And I'm delighted to welcome Lesley Byrne, the ICAS Director of Regulatory Monitoring, who will be here to take us through and provide those insights and tips that will assist you in your design and implementation processes. So Lesley was previously ICAS between 2004 and 2019, when Lesley was responsible for bringing in the audit monitoring function within ICAS. Lesley then briefly left ICAS to go to a global accountancy network as their head of quality. And as part of that role, Lesley had responsibility for designing and implementing the firm's system of quality management to be in accordance with ISQM. So I'm delighted to have Lesley here today. Lesley.
Thanks, James. As James says, I've been living and breathing ISQM1 for the last 2 years, so hopefully I'll be able to share some insights with you today and also talk a little bit about, our perspective from the audit monitoring point of view as well.
Thanks, Lesley. So could you take us through the key changes, please?
Well, obviously, we've got a new suite of standards called the Quality Management Standards, ISQM 1, 2, and ISO 220 revised. Today, we're really going to focus on ISQM 1, and it has an effective date of the 15th of December 22, and it really is quite a big meaty standard and really changes the way that firms will need to manage their audit practices. So that's why we're going to focus on that today. James, do you want to say a little bit about who it applies to?
Yeah, so the ISQM 1 applies to those firms that perform engagements undertaken in compliance with the performance standards issued by the Financial Reporting Council, FRC. And these comprise the audits of financial statements in accordance with the ISAs UK. It includes the reporting accountants engagements where they're doing the work in connection with an investment circular. It includes the reviews of interim financial information where those are undertaken by the auditor in accordance with the International Standard and Review Engagements UK 2410. It includes engagements to provide assurance in client assets to the Financial Conduct Authority, and of course it includes the assurance engagements specified by the FRC as those being public interest assurance engagements performed in accordance with the International Standard on Assurance Engagements UK 3000.
So that's quite a list, but actually when it boils down, we're really talking about all audit firms and some more sort of pie review engagement. Is that right, James?
Yeah, I mean, for the vast majority of ICAS regulated audit firms, it really will be the audits that are the primary focus. There will be some, but there are other engagements caught by the list which I just gave. But to all intents and purposes, the focus for many firms will be an audit.
Great, thank you.
So Lesley, can you now take us on and describe how does the new standard compare to the extant standard, International Standard and Quality Control UK 1?
Sure. So many of you will be familiar with ISQC 1. It's been in our lives for quite a long time now, and that was more sort of a plug and play sort of a standard. Essentially said if you had various quality control policies and procedures in place, then you should be able to produce a good audit. That's kind of ripped up now, and we've got a very different approach. And the approach is that each firm has to have a system of quality management. And it's a risk-based approach. In other words, each firm has its own unique system of quality management based on the risks in their firm and how to mitigate those risks, because it's recognised that each firm is very different and the risks faced by each firm is very different. So the risks in a very small firm are very different from the risks in a large complex firm. And we call that the kind of conditions, events, circumstances, actions or inactions in the standard. What essentially means is you need to reflect, in the risks in your own firm. And it's a very more sort of proactive approach. In other words, it's more forward looking. You're trying to kind of identify the risks in the future, try and stop them from happening, or if they do happen, trying to mitigate them. So it's a far more sort of thought-provoking standard and requires a lot more thinking.
Lesley, could you now take us through the main aims of the new standard, please?
Sure. So it's really saying that if you've got a good system of quality management in place, then you should be able to produce good audits. And it's recognising that auditors are very familiar with risks, or should be, because that's your job. You're going into clients, you're looking at the risks in the audit, and then you're identifying how you're going to respond to those risks. It's a very similar approach here in that you're looking at yourself now and looking at your own audit firm, and you're thinking, what are the risks in my firm and how am I going to mitigate them? So all auditors should have the capabilities to be able to do this. And it's essentially saying if you identify the risks and you mitigate them, then you stand in good way to actually being able to produce good quality audits. And we'll come back to this nice diagram on the right hand side here later on once we've kind of unpacked it a little bit more.
We now move on to the responsibility for the system of quality management, Lesley, and some interesting points to note here.
Yeah, might come as a surprise to some firms actually that the person with ultimate responsibility for the system of quality management is actually not the audit compliance partner now, but the CEO, managing partner or managing board. So there's a kind of new role there for the person, the top dog, to take responsibility. There is then the person with operational responsibility, and that's most likely to be the audit compliance partner, the person who's, at the moment responsible for the system of quality control will be responsible for the system of quality management, the day-to-day operations. But it also recognises that some aspects of the system of quality management are more specific and may require more specific input from other personnel. So for example, if you get independence, you might involve the ethics partner. If it's to do with HR, for example, you might have a partner or a director who's responsible for HR, and you might involve them in those specific aspects of the system of quality management. The important thing in the standard is you have to allocate responsibility, ultimate responsibility to the CEO or managing partner, and you have to allocate operational responsibility. So there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever who is responsible for what.
On that ultimate responsibility point, Lesley, was that deliberate to really place this at the very top, like the CEO or managing partner?
Absolutely, no chance about this whatsoever. It wasn't uncommon for us when we're going out monitoring visits under the old ISQC one to find that the audit compliance partner kind of got the role by default. It was, everybody else, maybe put it to the more junior partner in the firm or somebody that, didn't mind doing the job that everybody else didn't want to do. And sometimes we found that audit compliance partners were not getting the support they needed or the time or resources to be able to do the job properly. And they would have this kind of fight on or battle on their hands to try and get more resources to do the job properly. That is taken away now because what it's essentially saying is the person responsible for the firm, the managing partner, has a responsibility here to make sure that they're ultimately responsible and to make sure that the person with operational responsibility gets all the resources they need. So it's very much on purpose putting responsibility with the managing partner. So that's a very important change from the old ISQC one.
Thanks, Lesley. Now, Lesley, could you take us through this new approach in terms of the system of quality management? What is there and what do we need to know?
So there's three key things that you need to set up to start with, and that's objectives, risks, and responses. Now, what do we mean by each of those terms? Well, first of all, what's an objective? This is what you are trying to achieve. You're trying to achieve a good quality audit firm. What are the objectives that you're going to set up to achieve that? So what you're trying to achieve to start with, you're going to set them out. We'll talk later on about that. There's a number of mandatory objectives in the standard, and we'll come back to that later on. So you're going to set objectives to start with, and you're then going to identify risks. That is what could go wrong. In other words, what's stopping you from achieving those objectives? So you have to identify your risks. This is why we're saying it's a more risk-based approach now. What are the risks facing your firm? Then, once you've identified your risks, how do you deal with them? In other words, how do you mitigate them or sort them out, stop them from happening? Or if they do happen, how do you minimize the impact of them? So that's the responses. And the responses essentially are your policies and procedures, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So objectives is what you're trying to achieve. Risks are what could go wrong, and responses are how do you, deal with those risks. So that's the first stage. Now, unpacking it a little bit more, the bit that's probably going to be the most tricky for firms is the risks part. What you have to do is you have to identify the risks to start with, and then you have to assess your risks. And then assessing risks, what we're saying is we want to consider what the likelihood is of the risk arising and the impact if it does arise. Now, does that seem familiar to you, James?
Yeah, it brings back risk registers, but this whole process, in fact, Lesley, it just brings me back to this is what auditors do on a daily basis. This is the bread and butter. They go into clients and you're assessing these risks. So now you're having to do it internally. So you should be well versed with the work you do externally to bring this in-house and make sure that you really do get to the bottom of these risks, because of course that is essential. Because if we don't get the right risks properly identified and assessed, then the system is not going to be compliant. So it's really, let's get the focus internally that we apply externally.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, the main focus of all of this is in the risk assessment, and that, you know, when we look at the monitoring side of things, when we come out to monitor you, it will be whether you've done an appropriate risk assessment. Because if you think about it this way, you know, we've all just been through COVID, and the risks in relation to COVID were very different for each firm, weren't they? How you responded to the COVID risks in your firm, how easy was it for you to work remotely? Did you have all the systems and procedures you needed to do that? You know, were the personnel set up to be able to work from home and so on? Each firm was very differently affected by it. And so that's what we're saying here. Each risk for, you know, in every firm is very different, and therefore a lot of this is about identifying which risks apply to you, and then what impact do they have on your firm, and then what we're going to do about it. Moving on to responses now. Again, this will actually be familiar because actually this was the starting point for ISQC1. The responses are your firm's policies and procedures. Now, you already have policies and procedures in place. So actually, all you're doing is, before the policies and procedures, putting in your objectives and risks. And that this will be more familiar territory for most firms. It was a starting point for ISQC1, as I said, is your policies and procedures. So that is about objective risk responses. So setting what you want to achieve, identifying what stops you from achieving it, and then putting in responses to mitigate those risks. Now, one other part of this, as I said, it was a three-part thing. I'm actually was simplifying it a little bit too much. We also have something called monitoring and remediation. Now, monitoring, again, is a familiar subject for everybody. Everybody has been required to conduct audit compliance reviews each year. That is no different. That is still a requirement of the standard. But now what you're doing when you're doing your monitoring is you're also thinking about, you know, the objective setting, whether your risk assessments are appropriate or not, as well as the firm's policies and procedures, which is the responses bit. So the monitoring widens a little bit to take in these new objectives, risks and responses. We then have something quite new. We talk a bit about follow-up action in the old standard ISQC1, but now it really is firmed up here. We've got requirements for what we call remediation. And that is where firms are required to really think about how they're going to sort out any issues or weaknesses they identify during monitoring. And we bring in a specific requirement for root cause analysis. Do you want to say something about that, James?
Yeah, well, what's really vital here is that firms get to the underlying cause of any issues. So in the past, you know, a lot of focus has been placed on lack of training, as if training will cure everything. So what really has to be done here is really to go through like the 5 why process, keep asking why has something happened, and really explore that to make sure you do get to the underlying reason. Because if you get to the underlying reason, we can then correct the problem. But of course, superficially, training has been seen as the easy target in the past.
It always has.
Yeah,
Indeed.
and sometimes that might have been right. It might have been correct. Yeah. But as we know, under this new approach, we really need to get to the bottom of this. So keep the 5 whys and make sure you go through that process. But obviously, we will do more at a future date in this. But just if you stick with that 5 whys for the moment and trying to get to the underlying root of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll pick up in a different presentation on root cause analysis because it is quite a thing to get your head around. As James says, quite often training was the answer to most things when we did monitoring visits. Whereas in reality, if you've got a poor audit file, for example, is it just training, or is it actually that the audit fee was too low, or that you've not allocated enough resource to the audit? Or is it that you've got a bit of a toxic combination with individuals involved in the audit? Or were the deadlines too tight? You know, there could be many, many causes, and just saying training might not have sorted out the issue. And actually what this is requiring you to go is to go right back to the root, try and identify where did it all start to go wrong. And if you can do that, then it's not going to happen again. So root cause analysis is very important, and it's something we'll cover in a future presentation. But once you've identified your root causes of the issues, then you need to actually start taking action to them. And this is where firms will need to have action plans, track the progress, give action owners over who's responsible for resolving this issue. What deadline do they have to resolve it by? How are you going to check that the action was successful or not? We do recommend that firms have action plans in place that they can track the progress. So that's monitoring and remediation. So in totality, that's really your system of quality management, setting your objectives, risks and responses, monitoring them to see whether they're effective or not, identifying issues, going back to the causes of the issues, resolving them, and it's a kind of what we call the circle of life. Essentially, you're going, it's iterative, it's all happening at the same time, it's continuous, it's not a kind of one and done sort of situation, it is a continuous improvement is being looked at here.
I think that's a great way of describing it, Lesley, a circle of life, because it just puts, across this, that this will constantly continue to evolve and improve, and people will need to also adapt to changing conditions as well to make sure that the risks haven't changed, the client base may change, that may create new risks and so forth. So it's this idea that the circle of life constantly will evolve, but you need to ensure that you have proper monitoring and remediation processes in place that can then feed back and continually improve this system.
Absolutely. Now, that was relatively simple. Now we just add in an extra layer of detail here. What are you setting objectives, risks and responses for, and what are you monitoring and what you're remediating? Well, essentially, ISQM1 talks about the components of a system of quality management, and actually that should be quite familiar. We'll talk about what ISQC1 said in a minute, but actually we had components in ISQC1, and you'll see there that essentially what you're doing is you're setting up your system of quality management to cover the following things. You need to have a risk assessment, which we've actually just covered. Obviously, that's you're setting your risk and assessing the impact and likelihood. You need to have governance and leadership brought into your objectives, risks and responses. You need to have ethics requirements considered, acceptance and contingents, engagement performance, resources, information, communications. And then we talked about monitoring and remediation. So if you take the bits in red there, they're already in this diagram, but everything else, you're having to set up your objectives, risks and responses for, monitor and remediate them. And we'll talk a little bit in a moment about how that compares with ISQC1. So in other words, you're having to set objectives for governance and leadership. What are your risks in relation to governance and leadership? What responses do you need to have in place for governance and leadership? Same thing for resources. What objectives do you have? What risks do you have? What responses and so on? We'll go through examples later on as well on this.
So Lesley, if you compare the components in the new standard with those which are in ISQC1, could you give us just a bit of flavour of that, please?
Sure. So on the left-hand side there, we've got the ISQC1 old components, and on the right-hand side, we have the new ones. So you'll see there at the very top right-hand side, we've got risk assessment, and you'll see there is no read across to the old standard. So risk assessment is new. As we said, we're moving from compliance to risk-based approach, and we talked about risk assessment. That's where you set your objectives and you identify your risks and you assess the impact and likelihood. So you're going to have to do that now. When we get into the other components, you'll see there that the slight changes, they're nuances. So for example, in ISQC1, we had leadership. Now we have governance and leadership, which means that we have to think about when we're setting objectives, risks and responses, the governance structure within the firm. How is it governed? What is the managing partner situation? Is there a board in place? What are the governance arrangements for the firm? So that's very important. You'll see that the next three are very similar. Ethical requirements, acceptance, contingents, engagement, performance haven't changed that much. But where we start to see more changes are in relation to resources. You'll see that what we used to have in old ISQC1 was human resources. So that was very focused on people risks, competence, CPD, learning development, appraisals. It's pivoted now. that is all still in there. So we still have all the people risks and people objectives and responses. But what we now have is a wider resources. So this also means any other resources you need to do your audits and manage your audit firm. So for example, your technologies that you use, it could also mean technical resources, you know, technical training and so on. So resources is far wider now. We also have something that's new now that wasn't in the old standard called information and communications. And that's about communications both internally within the firm and externally to others, such as clients or regulators, for the example. So if we give an example of that, communications, you know, firms have policies and procedures. If they don't communicate them effectively to their employees, then employees will not know how to behave or what they're meant to be doing. So that's why communications are very important. And then finally, we've got monitoring, and you'll see, as we said before, monitoring is now monitoring and remediation. And that is because the focus now is not so much in what are my issues or my weaknesses, it's far more focused on how do I sort them out. Back to that circle of life. In other words, you identify an issue, you remediate it, it's back in the system of quality management again. So remediation is even more of a focus than monitoring.
Thanks, Lesley. So could you just summarise here in terms of the aims of ISQM 1?
So we covered it at the beginning. Obviously, now you should maybe understand it hopefully a bit better, that we are really looking at assessing our risks and mitigating our risks. That's what it boils down to. And if you do that, then what we're trying to then achieve is a good, well-managed quality audit practice, and therefore the ability to have good quality audits. But if we look on the right-hand side now, this is a slightly fancier diagram than I was able to produce. You'll see hopefully that it kind of sums it all up. You'll see in the center there all the components. So you've got governance and leadership, ethical requirements, acceptance, continuance, engagement, performance, resources, information, communication. So that's all your components of your system of quality management. And what you're doing is on the outside, in other words, you're doing a risk assessment process. That's setting your objectives, doing your risk assessment, identifying your responses, and then you're monitoring and remediating any issues you identify. So that is basically the whole thing, and hence why we're kind of calling it the circle of life, because essentially it's an iterative, continual thing where you're setting your objective risk responses and then you're constantly improving them.
And I think that's just a great term, Liz. I'll repeat that again because I think that will stick in people's minds, that this need, you know, that there will be the need for continual improvement through the monitoring and the mediation. I think the point you made earlier as well, Lesley, about it's for your firm. No one knows your firm better than yourselves. So you're really looking here at something that really should be absolutely crystal clear in terms of the risks your firm faces and what you then have to do, you know, to put in place responses to those risks. So that is why this standard is proportionate, because it is trying to really focus on each individual firm and what is the system of quality management that's required to meet, you know, the risks that that particular firm faces.
That's absolutely correct. And that's why we hope it's not just seen as a compliance exercise. Actually, it should help you manage your firm better. That's what the aim is.
Yeah, it should help manage the firm, and then should be a protection for the firm as well.
Yeah,
quality
absolutely.
Means, you know, the reputation of the firm will be maintained, and of course reduces any risk of any claims against the firm, because you're always producing high quality work and so forth. So this really is something which should be looked upon as a benefit to the firm as a whole, and something which, you know, really does put quality at the front of what the firm is doing.
Indeed.
Well, thanks, Lesley. That covers the first part of our session today, and I'm sure people will tune in for the later sessions. Thank you.
Thanks.